Well, now we turn again to the classics in Book at Bedtime as David Horovitch reads the history of the Peloponnesian War by the ancient Greek historian Thucydides, charting the ferocious wars during the 5th century BC between Athens and Sparta. Tonight, the brutality of war and a game-changing confrontation at Pylos. But first, an introduction from the Abridger, Tom Holland.
The war between Athens and Sparta saw the two greatest powers in the Greek world go head-to-head. The Athenians sought to deploy their naval supremacy to secure victory, and the Spartans to win by land. Neither side, though, could secure a decisive advantage, and so, as year followed year, the hostilities continued and came increasingly to engulf the entire Greek world. Never was the pathologist's gaze that Thucydides fixed upon the horrors of the age more unsparing than when he came to describe the impact of the war upon those cities caught up in its slipstream. Indeed, the analysis he offered of civic breakdown has possibly never been bettered.
During the whole period of peacetime, when Pericles was at the head of affairs, the state was wisely led and firmly guarded, and it was under him that Athens was at her greatest. And when the war broke out, here, too, he appears to have accurately estimated what the power of Athens was. He survived the outbreak of war by 2 years and 6 months, and after his death his foresight with regard to the war became even more evident. For Pericles had said that Athens would be victorious if she bided her time and took care of her navy, if she avoided trying to add to the empire during the course of the war, and if she did nothing to risk the safety of the city itself. But his successors did the exact opposite, and in other matters which apparently had no connection with the war, private ambition and private profit led to policies which were bad both for the Athenians themselves and for their allies. Such policies, when successful, only brought credit and advantage to individuals, and when they failed, the potential of the entire state was impaired. Meanwhile, practically the whole of the Greek world was convulsed by the war between Athens and Sparta. Rival parties began to emerge in every state, democratic leaders trying to bring in the Athenians, and oligarchs trying to bring in the Spartans. In peacetime there would have been no excuse for calling them in, but in time of war, when each party could always count upon an alliance which would do harm to its opponents and at the same time strengthen its own position, it became a natural thing for anyone who wanted a change of government to call in help from outside. In the various cities these revolutions were the cause of many calamities, as happens, and always will happen while human nature is what it is. It was on the island of Corcyra that the first examples of the breakdown of law and order occurred. There was the revenge taken in their hour of triumph by those who had in the past been arrogantly oppressed instead of wisely governed. There were the wicked resolutions taken by those who, particularly under the pressure of misfortune, wished to escape from their usual poverty and coveted the property of their neighbours. There were the savage and pitiless actions into which men were carried not so much for the sake of gain as because they were swept away into an internecine struggle by their ungovernable passions. With the backing of an Athenian fleet which had arrived in Corcyra and stayed there 7 days, the Corcyrians massacred those of their own citizens whom they considered their enemies. Their victims were accused of conspiring to overthrow the democracy, but in fact men were often killed on grounds of personal hatred, or else by their debtors because of the money that they owed. There was death in every shape and form, and, as usually happens in such situations, people went to every extreme and beyond it. Fathers killed their sons. Men were dragged from the temples or butchered on the very altars. Some were actually walled up in the temple of Dionysus and died there. So revolutions broke out in city after city. To fit in with the change of events, Words, too, had to change their usual meanings. What used to be described as a thoughtless act of aggression was now regarded as the courage one would expect to find in a party member. To think of the future and wait was merely another way of saying one was a coward. Any idea of moderation was just an attempt to disguise one's unmanly character. Ability to understand a question from all sides meant that one was totally unfitted for action. Fanatical enthusiasm was the mark of a real man, and to scheme against an enemy behind his back was perfectly legitimate self-defence. To plot successfully was a sign of intelligence, but it was still cleverer to see that a plot was hatching. In short, it was equally praiseworthy to get one's blow in first against someone who was going to do wrong, and to denounce someone who had no intention of doing any wrong at all. 2 years on from the revolution in Corcyra, and the Corsarians continued to suffer from the raids made on them by the party exiled from the city who had taken refuge in the mountains. 60 Peloponnesian ships sailed to support the exiles, and since there was a serious famine in the city, their view was that it would be easy to gain control of affairs there. Meanwhile, an Athenian fleet of 40 ships had been instructed to see what they could do for the Corsarians. But when they were off the coast of Laconia, they heard that the Spartan ships had already arrived at Corcyra. As the generals in command were deliberating what to do, a storm happened to get up, and so the ships were forced to go to Pylos. Demosthenes, one of the Athenian generals, immediately proposed fortifying the place, this being in fact the reason why he had joined the expedition in the first place. Pylos is about 45 miles from Sparta, in what used to be, until the Spartans conquered it, the country of the Messenians. It had a harbour close by, and the Messenians were capable, Demosthenes thought, of doing a lot of damage if they had it as a base, and would also be a very reliable garrison for it. The Athenians spent 6 days in fortifying the place on the side facing the land, and in the other most necessary parts. They then left Demosthenes behind with 5 ships as a garrison, and hurried on their way to Corcyra with the main body of the fleet. When the Peloponnesians in Attica heard of the capture of Pylos, they immediately withdrew and returned home, for the Spartans and Agis, their king, considered that here was a threat to their vital interests. Orders were issued all round the Peloponnese for troops to proceed as quickly as possible to Pylos. Demosthenes, though, had anticipated them, and had secretly sent out 2 ships to inform the Athenian fleet that Pylos was in danger, and to urge them to come to his help. The fleet followed his instructions and sailed to Pylos as fast as possible. Meanwhile, the Spartans made ready to attack the Athenian fortification, both from the land and from the sea. Close into the shore of Pylos lay Sphacteria, an island about 1.5 miles long and covered in woods. And since the Spartans feared that the enemy might occupy the island and make use of it against them, they carried some heavy infantry across to it and placed others on the mainland. For 2 days they attacked the Athenians, and then, on the 3rd day, the Athenian fleet arrived. At this sight, the Spartans were overwhelmed with horror, since it meant that their own men were now cut off on the island. The Athenian ships began to cruise round the island. Their enemies there had no way of escaping, and so they guarded it closely. The Peloponnesians on the mainland, who had now come up in full force, stayed in their positions before Pylos. From then on, the Athenians always had 2 ships on patrol by day, sailing round the island in opposite directions, and at night the whole fleet was anchored all around it. Meanwhile, the Peloponnesians were in camp on the mainland, and kept up their attacks on the wall, on the lookout for any opportunity which might present itself for saving the men on the island. Lack of food and water made the blockade a difficult operation for the Athenians, and so, as a result, they were increasingly at a loss what to do, and feared that the advent of winter might put a stop to the blockade. It then happened, however, that a fire began on one of the extreme points of the island. The wind got up, and nearly the whole of the wood was burnt down. Demosthenes recognized that the island was now easier to land on, and so he began to make preparations for the attempt. He sent for troops from the allies in the neighbourhood, and then, embarking all his heavy infantry on a few ships, put to sea while it was still dark. He landed just before dawn on both sides of the island, from the open sea and from the harbour, about 800 of them altogether. The Spartans, taken by surprise, found themselves exposed to attack on both sides. Indeed, to compare small things with great, they were in the same situation as in the Battle of Thermopylae, where the Spartan army was destroyed by the Persians getting round behind them by the path. So these Spartans were now caught between two fires, and were no longer able to stand their ground. What with the superior numbers of their enemy and their own exhaustion from lack of food, they fell back. And at this point Demosthenes made a proclamation through a herald, asking if they would surrender themselves and their arms to the Athenians, to be dealt with at their discretion. When the Spartans heard the words of the herald, most of them lowered their shields and waved their hands to show that they accepted the offer. For that day and the following night the Athenians kept them under guard, and on the next day, after putting up a trophy on the island, they got ready to sail. Altogether, 440 Spartans had crossed over to Sphacteria, and of these 292 were taken alive to Athens, the rest having been killed. It was an event which caused more surprise among the Greeks than anything else that happened in the war. The general impression had been that Spartans would never surrender their arms, whether because of hunger or any other form of compulsion. Instead, they would keep them to the last and die fighting as best they could. It was hard to believe that those who had surrendered were the same sort of people as those who had fallen. The Spartans, though, eager for revenge, did not slacken in their efforts, and 3 years after the Athenian victory at Pylos, both sides were ready at last for peace. The efforts were made by the two statesmen who had the best claims to influence in each city. The Spartan king Pleistouanax, son of Pausanias, and Nicias, the son of Niceratus. Discussions went on throughout the winter, and as spring drew near there were threats from Sparta of another invasion, all this in order to make the Athenians more inclined to accept the terms offered. In the end it was agreed that peace should be made on the basis of each party's giving back what it had acquired during the war, the Spartan prisoners included. The treaty was then concluded, and so peace was made between Athens and Sparta.
Tomorrow, the art of negotiation, as David Horovitch continues reading Thucydides, The History of the Peloponnesian War.